This is Richard Wolff, and today we're looking at the one thing Donald Trump finally managed to unite Canada around. Not America, but the decision to stop building America's future for him. For 40 years, Canada was treated like a quiet subcontractor of the U.S. empire. More than 75% of Canadian steel exports went south. Auto parts, 4 out of 5 were designed for American assembly lines. Entire cities, Hamilton, Windsor, Oshawa, lived or died on what Washington decided in a closed room. Then came Trump, tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminum, threats on autos. Not because Canada cheated, not because Canada attacked anyone, but because Trump wanted a headline and a villain. He slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, called it a national security threat, and went to a rally to brag that he was finally standing up to our so called friends. Translation: he used Canada's workers as props in his re election theater. What he didn't understand was simple. When you treat an ally like a punching bag, eventually they stop standing there. In a calm, almost surgical interview, Industry Minister Mélanie Joly did something U.S. presidents never expected a Canadian official to do on live TV. She stopped begging for exemptions and started mapping out an exit. Not from trade, from dependence. She spelled it out. Canada's steel plants were engineered on a U.S. first model. The thickness, the grades, the standards, all tailored to Detroit, not to Toronto, not to Calgary, not to Halifax. Every coil of steel was a quiet admission: we exist to feed America's machine. Under Trump, that dependence went from uncomfortable to suicidal. When his tariffs hit, over 30,000 Canadian industrial jobs were suddenly at risk. Plants froze investment, orders stalled, projects tied to U.S. demand were delayed or canceled. Workers in Hamilton watched their livelihood swing on one man's Twitter feed. Joly drew a red line. She said Canada would pivot its steel, aluminum, and lumber toward itself, toward Canadian pipelines, Canadian bridges, Canadian homes, Canadian shipyards. She didn't shout, she didn't rant. She did something far more dangerous to Trump's ego. She made him irrelevant. Behind her calm tone was a brutal indictment. While Trump was screaming about America first, he had actually triggered Canada first. While he was busy bullying allies on TV, Canada's cabinet was quietly rewriting its economic playbook. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government put numbers behind the rhetoric. $1 trillion investment plan in housing, green energy, and infrastructure, a Buy Canadian Act that forces federal projects to prioritize domestic steel, labor, and design, new procurement rules that make U.S. suppliers just one option, not the default, not the master key. For the first time in decades, Canadian officials weren't flying to Washington to ask, can we please keep access? They were asking their own industries, how fast can we replace it? Trump's tariffs were supposed to prove American strength. Instead, they exposed American fragility. If one White House tantrum can push an ally to redesign its entire industrial base, the problem isn't Canada's loyalty. The problem is America's addiction to economic blackmail. Canada looked at that addiction and said, enough. Because in a world of rising protectionism, the real superpower is not the country that screams the loudest at its neighbors. It's the country that no longer has to listen. What Joly and Carney put on the table wasn't just policy. It was a quiet indictment of Trump's entire dealmaker mythology. Trump built his brand on the idea that he could squeeze allies for better terms and walk away richer. But the math in Canada tells a different story. Since his first steel tariffs, U.S. exporters have faced an estimated $18 billion in retaliatory and redirected trade flows, while Canadian manufacturers have accelerated contracts with Europe and Asia instead. The man who shouted America is no longer the world's piggy bank ended up closing the ATM on his own side of the border. Inside Canada's factories, the shift is brutal but strategic. Lines that once stamped out steel for SUVs in Michigan are being recalibrated for LNG pipelines in British Columbia. Rolling mills in Ontario that used to chase US safety codes are now matching Canadian infrastructure standards. According to internal projections, up to 40% of steel capacity previously reserved for US auto chains is being reassigned to domestic projects over the next 5 years. That is not a negotiation tactic. That is an exit. And here's the detail Trump's base will never hear at a rally. This pivot doesn't just hurt Canada less, it hurts American workers more. When Canada decides to stop subsidizing the US supply chain with cheap, reliable, politically quiet inputs, someone in Ohio or Michigan is going to pay the price, not the billionaire shareholders. The union worker on the line. Joly reminded GM and Stellantis of something Trump will never say out loud. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, Canadian taxpayers put billions on the table to save North American auto giants. Ottawa took equity. Canadians took the risk. They helped keep American plants alive. Now, with Trump's tariffs lighting fires under the sector again, Canada is saying, we were there for you. You will now be there for us. That's not anti-American. That's anti-Trump. Carney's government is using Trump's chaos as political fuel. Every time Washington weaponizes tariffs, Ottawa adds another layer of insulation. Defense contracts, Canadian steel. Naval vessels in Halifax and Vancouver, Canadian steel. Public housing and rail expansion, Canadian-made materials backed by multi-year commitments worth tens of billions of dollars. Trump wanted leverage. He created a laboratory for economic independence. Instead, behind the scenes, Canadian officials talk about economic sovereignty with a bluntness you almost never hear from US Democrats. They see what Trump has turned America into, an unstable customer, a blackmailing partner, a country that treats allies like bargaining chips and dictators like business prospects. In that environment, the rational response isn't loyalty, it's distance. While Trump yells about bringing manufacturing home, his policies are teaching America's closest neighbor how to live without him. While he boasts that tariffs are bringing in billions, he never finishes the sentence. Billions paid by American consumers, American businesses, and now in strategic terms by American influence. Because once Canada finishes this industrial pivot, those red hats can keep chanting America first all they want. The steel in Canada's bridges, ships, and homes won't hear them. Once you understand what Canada is doing, you see the bigger scandal. Trump didn't just hurt Canadian workers. He downgraded America's power, and he did it for applause. Global influence isn't measured only in aircraft carriers or nuclear stockpiles. It's measured in who depends on your markets, your currency, your demand. For decades, Canada's industrial system was wired into the US grid. That dependence gave Washington quiet leverage, one tariff threat, one regulatory tweak, and Ottawa would scramble to keep the peace. Trump burned that leverage on a campaign slogan. Instead of using that structural power responsibly, he treated it like a casino chip. He slapped tariffs on friends, praised autocrats, and turned trade policy into a reality show. The result? Canada, the polite neighbor, finally stopped playing along. Look at the numbers Carney's government is now pushing. A 10-year, $600, a billion public investment program in housing, clean energy, and infrastructure. A projected 150,000 new industrial jobs linked directly to domestic content rules. A target to cut dependence on US steel imports for federal projects from 70% to under 20% within a decade. Every one of those numbers tells the same story. The United States used to be the gravitational center of Canada's economy. Now, under Trump's shadow, Canada is deliberately looking for a different orbit, and there's a moral dimension Trump's fans refuse to confront. When he calls tariffs beautiful and brags that other countries are finally respecting America, he never visits the factory in Hamilton that had to freeze hiring because his tweet spooked investors. He never sits with the welder in Windsor whose overtime disappeared when orders tied to U.S. projects were cut. He never faces the reality that his showmanship pushed an ally to protect itself from him. Meanwhile, Canadian politics is doing something U.S. politics has almost forgotten, using industrial policy to build security for workers instead of security for stock prices. By tying steel, shipbuilding, energy, and housing into a coherent national strategy, Carney and Joly are sending a message south of the border. This is what a serious country does when faced with chaos. It doesn't beg the arsonist to be nicer, it fireproofs the house. For progressives in the U.S., that's the real lesson. Trump's nationalism isn't strength, it's weakness dressed up in a red hat. A strong nation doesn't need to bully allies into dependence. A strong nation makes itself so reliable, so stable, so fair that allies want to stay close. Canada looked at Trump's America and saw the opposite. A government that treats trade like a weapon, workers like photo ops, and allies like props. So it chose something different, not isolation, but insulation. And here's the irony history will not forget. Trump wanted a world in which every country bows to America first. What he's building instead is a world in which more and more countries quietly decide not if it's Trump's America. Canada's shift on steel is not a side story, it's a warning flare. When even your closest neighbor starts redesigning its economy around the possibility that you might be in charge again, that's not winning, that's fear. And when the fear fades and the new factories are built, when the contracts are signed and the supply chains are rewired, the man who screamed loudest about sovereignty will realize something brutal. He didn't make America stronger. He taught the rest of the world how to live without it.